City Hall today, researchers from Texas A&M Corpus Christi presented an updated forecast for how the COVID-19 pandemic has and will affect South Texas. The scientists say the coastal bend has fared really very well compared to their original predictions. They say the transmission rate across Texas has gone down from last week. However, they say the number of new cases in the coastal bend is increasing, and they believe that may be a result of Memorial Day weekend.
Non-essential activity is increasing. This is what the cell phone data shows us. But even though that non-essential activity is increasing, which you would think would lead to increased transmission rates, it's not. COVID-19 does not seem to be expanding in South Texas.
They say something they are noticing is that fewer people are going to the hospital or their doctor's office out of fear that they might be infected by the coronavirus.